Today we'll give you an overview of Natural Pro, natural protection. These are things you put in the rocks to catch you if you fall while you're climbing, or support rescue systems that are different from drilling bolts and putting them in the wall. So we'll start with the passive protection. Passive, as opposed to active, are types of protection that don't really move around. Like these are chocks, also known as stoppers. That's the Black Diamond name, and lots of different, but C-H-O-C-K, chalk. And these things simply slide into crevices, find a constriction, and set it in. You can set them all different angles, whichever one works best. You want to get the most contact onto the metal, and depending what kind of rock you're in, you probably also, once you clip your runner onto the bottom and clip your rope to it, or as you're setting it, give it a few really good tugs to really set it down into that crack. Now, if you're in granite with lots of sharp little crystals in there, if you set that really good, you may not get it out. So you can do it a little bit looser. But the key is, you don't want, as you're climbing up, you don't want the rope to work that loose and walk your piece right out. So set it in there good. Also, another thing you can do is, if you just have a single quick draw, like for sport climbing in there, and your rope's moving through it, it's going to lift that up and down a little bit. That might wiggle it longer. So if you want to really dampen that vibration from the rope movement, you can put a really long runner in it. That way, that bottom beam around the end of your runner can wiggle all at once, and it's not really going to affect your Pro up at this end. Another good reason for long runners is if you have a route that moves from one side to the other, back and forth, because that's where the cracks are, that's where the weaknesses are in the rock, where you can put some Pro. Then if your rope is zigzagging back and forth through your beaners, you'd be surprised how much rope drag that will cause, and it makes it almost impossible for you to pull the rope through, no matter how much slack your belay is giving you. So if instead you have long runners in between, then your rope does a more straight line in between all the different Pro, and runs a lot better. Might make you nervous, if you put a piece in and it's got another 3 or 4 feet of runner hanging below it, that's twice that much more you're going to fall if you come off. But it's better than being completely stopped. Other things you can do are, you can stack these pieces together. If you have a little wider crack, you can do things like that, whatever really works to fit. So we'll do a close-up in a minute with show you some actual placements in it. Another thing to consider also, besides getting in a good crack, is you have to evaluate your rock and make sure that it is secure. There are lots of great little cracks in here, but a lot of the rock is somewhat loose, so I'd be hesitant to trust it. One way to test it is just hit it with the butt of your hand. If you've got a hammer for pitons, then you can tap it with that as well. And if it has kind of a hollow sound, that thing is not necessarily as secure. If it doesn't, you can feel better about it, but you'll still want to be careful. So in some cases, you'll need to back up your gear, put multiple pieces in, equalize the weight to distribute the load, and not put so much force on any single piece. I remember a rescue we did at Bridal Veil several years ago, where it was right next to the falls, and we were just right up against a big limestone wall. And limestone often in our area tends to be a little bit rotten, and so there were no places for nuts even, but we were able to hammer some pitons on, which we'll cover in a minute. And we ended up hammering 9 different pitons all around, and then gathering them into collection points and clipping it together to equalize the load to the point where we felt good enough about putting a rescue load hanging on it. Other types of chocks and stuff are, there's these tri-cams, little newer technology. They're in triangles, and what that allows is that each angle of this triangle is a little different. So if it doesn't fit in one way, maybe you twist it and it fits in the other way and gets just the fit that you like. Also has these little hollow spots in there that maybe you can catch that up against a crystal or something like that to get an even better placement. So I like those. And I just brought a handful off my rack, but as you can see, they also come in much smaller sizes, all the way down to these little brassies. Okay, this little wire here and the way it's wedged into the brass, this is not strong enough to catch a big fall. It'll break it. So this is largely meant for aid climbing when you're, you know, clipping something into a little crack somewhere, and you get it in, and then you clip your atria, you know, kind of a ladder here, a sewn ladder, and you walk up it and reach up and put your next piece. So you're never really looking at a lead fall. But hey, it's better than nothing. If that's all you got, then go ahead and use it. What if you set these things in, they get pretty tight. Like I said, it can be really difficult to get them out. So one tool you'll want is a nut remover. Nut is another word for chalk, as you may have guessed. And if you have a little retainer loop on there, then you can often just leave it on your gear loop or something, and just get in there, you know, wherever your piece is set, and just tug at it and tap at it, you know, back and forth. And a lot of times you can get it to work loose. So there are different types of nut tools you can get for that. The other type of passive protection, let me show you first this one. If you want to get really big and passive pro, here is a hex, eccentric. See how it's also got different sizes, so you can set it in cracks all different ways, you know, whatever's gonna fit and catch, and you can, you know, set those in the same way for great big cracks. They're a little heavier and they're less popular these days because a lot of people are going to active protection like these cams. We'll get to that in a second, but sometimes hexes really are the way to go. So, all right, the other type of passive protection are pitons. So let me show you a few different types. This is one of my favorite types. See how it gets so much wider as it goes up? This is what I like to use here in our Utah limestone, because if you get these flatter ones like this, see, that's really good for nailing into a little tiny fissure. But a lot of times, you know, the cracks we have around here, you start nailing it in, the limestone starts to shatter a little bit. So this one, at least as you go in, it gets tighter and tends to lock in a little bit better. So I like those. You can also stack these as you need to, if you have to make it fit, you know. Put a couple flat ones. Here's a flat one with a little bit more of a wedge to it. You could stick those together to make it fit if you need to. And one really useful tip for nailing pins is that, let's say you've got a big one like this, and you hammer it into a crack, and it only goes about that far, and then you can see that if you hang your sling over on this edge and you weight it straight down, that's a lot of leverage trying to pull that thing out. So if that's as deep as you can get it, then what you can do is you can girth hitch some webbing around right there, right up against the wall, and loop it, and then clip into that webbing right there. And as you hammer it, and I'll try and find somewhere in a minute and do a close-up on this, you'll hear it, the pitch rises as it gets tighter and tighter, you know, so it's ding, 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 and when it gets nice high pitch, that's when you know it's a little more secure. Again, make sure the rock is solid. If you don't completely trust it, or even if you do, it's a good idea to back these up, have at least 2 or 3 of them in there if you're going to put a rescue load on there. Make sure people down rope feel safe with your judgment, because their lives may be in your hands. All right, here's a few more pitons. These are some old ones, and they're really soft. So if you have a tight little fissure and it kind of bends, this thing will actually go in and kind of form itself to that crack. So that's nice. But if you can imagine, if nuts get set, you know, hard by just setting or taking a little fall on them, imagine how hard these are to get out. So here's how you do that. What you need is a Funkness device. And I happen to have one right here. So what you need is something heavy, like a piton hammer, which you know, probably got anyway, and you can clip this on. A lot of times you'll have a cable. I've just got this cord, clip this onto your piton, you know, wherever it's set. Say it's set there, and by the way, before you do the Funkness device, you can just tap these up, tap them back and forth, eats away at the rock a little bit, loosens them up, and you might be able to work it loose. That's depending on where you're climbing, of course. On established routes, it's generally ill-advised, it's looked on poorly to hammer and rip it apart and continue to scar the rock and change it. So some routes are rated clean, in fact, instead of aid climbing, even like a C1 instead of an A1, so that saying, you know, this can be done clean, so don't be hammering and ruin the route. You know, don't use pins, just use this other passive and active protection. But if you've got to get it out, then, and it's really stuck in there, you don't want to pound it around and pick up the rock or whatever, you just attach that on there, and then lower your head. You don't want to catch this thing in the face because it can go flying all over the place. Make sure anybody around you is also, you know, protected from this, and get some momentum on this hammer. And when it runs out, it puts all that force in, and eventually you can break that thing loose. So that's how pitons work. Start talking about some active protection now. Let me show you one of the simpler pieces of Active Pro. This is a tri-cam. It looks like a nut, doesn't it? Only kind of swivels on the end of that webbing, and it can work as a nut. You know, this could be passive. You can just stick it in a crack and let that catch just like a nut, and that's fine. But if you let it rocker down, then it'll take a little wider crack, okay? And you set it in, you know, the crack, and for this to pull down further, see how this node down here, this knob has to go up. So if the crack's right there, you know, that creates a little extra pressure against the sides to hold it in place. These work fantastic. See how it's got just the short little nose on it there? These work great in flared cracks like that, where you're only going to get, you know, one edge on either side in contact. I found these, at least climbing down design and stuff, to be extremely secure. I love them when the need arises for them. More common active protection comes in the form of the camming device. Okay, different brands. This one, my Metolius, just has one trigger, so it's easy to deploy with one trigger. But if it had the, you know, these cables down the center, and this two sides could operate more independently, that helps you, you know, load it in to a crack and get it to fit, just custom fit. You can do it anyway, like pulling down on the little wires here to get them to activate, but it's whatever your preference is and where you're climbing. If you're climbing lots of straight in, you know, A0 perfect cracks, one finger is going to stick it in. You're not going to need to adjust it a lot anyway if you're done. But anyway, whatever your preference is. The important thing to remember, there's three important things to remember with these cams. One is you don't want to overcam. If you have to get it so tight, you know, so small to fit in the crack, and you get it and you shove it in there, if you can't get it any tighter, then how are you going to get it back out? Okay, they can set and get stuck there really bad. So don't overcam. Also, you don't want to undercam where it just barely has any spring, because the spring, which are inside between the lobes there, the cam lobes, that's what springs it out and puts some pressure on the wall and holds it in place. So it's barely there, that can be loose, and you know, if you clip straight to it, that vibration can walk it loose and pop it right out. So you might want to use a longer string as well. So there's a range in between where you want to run that. In fact, some cams have some color where it's like red and green and yellow or something like that, to show you just how far, you know, that needs to open. So these also come in various sizes. And the other thing, the last thing about these cams is you don't stick them in like this. Okay, if you put them in this way and your fall is here, what happens when you weight that? It could walk that thing right out of the crack. I saw this when I was first climbing, climber on a crag across from me. I saw him zipper about 40 feet down this overhanging 10C in Logan Canyon, and he had his brand new cams, and there were a bunch of kind of Wacos like this, and he had stuck them all in sideways like that, and when he fell, it just popped them all. And he got an open radius, or ulna, I guess, fracture. So don't do that. Let me show you the really small one like that. See, not a whole lot of range in there, but these are good for tight little cracks. We'll try and find something for it in a minute. You know, in the olden days, before they came up with these nice fancy wired nuts and everything, they used to just take a rock, wrap some webbing around it, and stick it, get it to lodge in a crack. You know, even the great big boulders that fall and get stuck in a big crack, those are also called chalk stones. That's where the name comes from. So they just wrap around it, and if that's lodged in there well enough, and you got your webbing around it, you know, and not too sharp of edges, it's adequate. Not quite as convenient, but it'll do the job. All right, let's get some close-ups on some placements. So here's a nice big crack, right? We're wrong, we'll see. Let's try it. A lot of times I'll just pull off my whole, like I'll separate on one beaner, I'll have all my bigger nuts and, you know, medium size and smaller. And you can just get these and just find a way to put it right there in the crack. Okay, set it. That's not going anywhere. Even if I wiggle it, that's pretty well set. So on one hand, it looks like it might be all right. But on the other hand, look at this big piece of rock where it's got cracks all around it. If I tap on that, there's a definite kind of hollow sound to it. If you're not sure, just tap on something that looks more solid. No vibration, you know, nothing behind it. So this is not an ideal placement by any means, but of course, if it's the best you got, back it up, be careful. You know, I'm not going to recommend that at all, actually, but that's all up to you. It's easy enough to break free. Let's try cam in there. Let's try number 6. So I closed that down a little too much, you know, almost all the way to get in the crack, but once it's back in there, now the cam's exposed. So, you know, they open up a little bit, so it's not over cammed, so that's reasonable. And it's okay to bend these this way. They're made to do that. In fact, the way this is bending now, it's different than what I told you about putting them sideways this way, because they don't bend very much this way. And, you know, if it's open crack above and below, that can walk out, but that one's really not going anywhere. So other than the loose piece of rock, that would be a reasonably okay setting. Let's try a piton while we're here. Dropping anything. I should really be wearing glasses at the time too, but I'm not going to hammer seriously. So I've got a crack in here that goes in a little ways and stops. Listen to the sound. See how that's getting higher and higher? Here's a much better spot. I'll try one of my nice thin pitons right in here. I could have used that thicker one. It would have broken apart the rock a little bit as I set it and probably stayed pretty tight. Let's see how this one goes though. I should really be wearing glasses as I do this, so I'm hitting it pretty carefully. You hear that pitch as it just rose and rose as it got up in there. So now this one has 2 holes in it. This one is inaccessible because it's up against the rock. But this top one over here, this one I can clip to. So let's imagine this was a draw or, you know, beaner or something. Probably put the gate away from the rock a little bit there, a little less like this. I'm just going to open it. And I would trust that. I would totally trust that. let's tap on this rock and listen to it just in case. Doesn't sound very hollow. Much more stable. If I was putting a rescue load on, I'd still back it up with a few more to go with it, but that's pretty good. All right, let's pull it out. Take off my other piton just so I have one less thing flying around. First thing to loosen it. It's pretty tight. It goes up, but breaks apart the rock as it goes. Let's try funk this and just see if we can get it out without damaging the rock more. Not really, so let's tap it some more. As you well know, climbing is an inherently dangerous activity, and what all this pro is for is to try and mitigate those risks, but it takes experience to have the kind of judgment to do things really right and not have things go wrong. So take some time, if you're new at this, get some training. This video is nowhere near adequate enough training for you to safely use Natural Pro. It's just a quick overview and reminder. And walk around on ground level, setting pro, clip into it, lean back, get used to what it takes to rip pieces, you know, how well you have to be set, and get some safe experience under your belt. Be safe.